Welcome to the Tough Fish Show. I am so excited to bring to you Jessica Booth. Jessica, thank you so
Ah,
much for being on the show.
thanks for having me today.
I am so glad you're here, and I would love for you to start with how did you get into writing?
Oh gosh, I have loved books since I was a little bitty girl when my parents would read Dr. Seuss and I would memorize the books and say it back to them at the tender young age of 3 or 4. And as I grew up in middle school, especially, I would say when I discovered like Tolkien and The Hobbit and these stories that really captured my heart, to me, writers were heroes. And it was something that I always saw as like kind of like a movie star, right? Like I would love to do that one day, but I don't think I'll ever actually get in those ranks. But I majored in professional writing and journalism in college, and I did like that. But all my creative writing courses were my favorite, and so I still continued to do that for a while with this big dream that maybe one day I'd write a book. And then I had a bunch of kids at once, had four in 4 years, and life got crazy until I finally I review a lot of books on my Bookstagram account, and I finally was like, I see a lot of these books that I really love, and I feel like I have a story to tell, and I think maybe I can do it. So that was it was my New Year's resolution for 2022 to finally sit down and write my book, and I did it. And yeah, I guess that's all she wrote.
Okay, you have said so many things in here that I would love to unpack a bit, please.
Sure,
Okay, so you made this New Year's resolution,
I
and
did.
so was the book even conceptualized at that point, or was it literally I am going to write a book and I have no idea what I'm going to write, and then it happened all in one year, or did you already have something you were working and it was I'm just going to make this piece, bring this piece is the piece I'm going to turn into the book, and this is the year I'm doing it.
So in my mind, I had a concept already. I always felt like I love romance books. I love happy books, books that make you smile. And in my mind, I always felt like, Christmas always gets the good romance books, the good Hallmark movies. And I love autumn and I love fall so much. And I was like, autumn and fall needs its own Christmas romance story. Not Christmas, but its own like fall festival romance story because I think that there's so much magic there in fall and autumn, and I know how many people love their pumpkin spice lattes, and so that was kind of my concept going in, is I wanted like the Christmas movie for fall, if you will. So that's what I started with. And when I sat down as a New Year's resolution to write the book, I will never forget, I read this interview with Stephanie Garber, who wrote the Caraval series, which is a very popular YA series. And she said, when I finally was successful, I just sat down and wrote a list of everything that I loved that I wanted to include in my book. So that's kind of where I started. I wrote down a list of everything I loved that I wanted to include in my book. And that was the launching point for my first outline, which then became the book.
Okay, so did you follow the outline? Like, did you take this as just a, was the outline more of like a skeleton of here are the key points I want to make sure that get included?
Yeah, it
Or was it
definitely
really
was a
more,
skeleton.
okay,
Yeah, it was definitely a skeleton. It was, even like at some point I started out, I was like, well, I kind of want this to be enemies to lovers, trope in the romance. But it really, as I got to know my characters, which I feel like a lot of writers talk about now, I kind of understand that. As my characters kind of came to life for me, I realized that this really wasn't that kind of story. It was more of like an unrequited love story. And so, like, even though I had my outline, as I began to write and got to know the story, it did evolve and change. And I had to rewrite the end of my outline. Actually, by the time after I'd written probably about 15 chapters, I was like, yeah, this has to change.
but I love that because that to me is showing the you're getting involved in the book, like you're really pushing your writing, but you're also staying open to what is coming back to you. And the characters, they start to talk to you. They literally start
Oh,
to
they
push
do.
back and
Yeah.
go, That's not me. Or I want to go over here. And you, the writer,
Hmm.
you need to come with me, not fight me in the sense, come with me. So
Yeah,
I love,
definitely.
yeah, I love that you stayed open to that. So you mentioned that you had other you wrote down the things that you were interested in including, the things that made you happy or you loved about fall
Yeah.
or in general. What are some other elements that you wanted to make sure you included, and how did you go about it?
Well, one, I knew I wanted to set it in North Louisiana, which is actually where I'm from. I feel like South Louisiana, New Orleans always gets so much attention, and North Louisiana is a different animal, and it's got this great small town, almost like Texas vibe to it. And so I knew that I wanted to incorporate that. I knew that because it was set in the South, I feel like the South gets so characterized sometimes, like stereotyped. But having lived that, I wanted to bring some of like, I feel like the true character of the people of the South to life. So that was definitely in my list of things that I wanted to include and kind of showcase again, not so it's not quite so stereotypical, but to paint like a real picture of what it's like. And I knew that it had to have, because I wanted it to be a romantic comedy, it had to have humor. And so I had to figure out what that looked like. I didn't want it to be like too cheesy, too on the nose. And so as I began to develop these characters, and I actually, one of my favorite characters in the book is she's kind of like your Gandalf, right? Like your guiding light, your wisdom seeker. She's based on my godmother, and my godmother knows this. But she is just kind of she doesn't hold any punches, and she tells you like it is. And her personality naturally lended itself to a lot of that humor. So as I began to write, I kind of discovered these things, and they kind of just emerged.
I think that is so sweet that she's in your book in such a way, in such a sweet and loving way, too. And
She is, but she's also full of sass. I mean, she is like, I would say she knows this. I mean, this is nothing new to her, but it's very how I see Southern women. Like just fiery, but to the point, and they want to tell you, as they say, bless your heart. They want to tell you like it is, but with love.
yeah, that's I can understand that. But
Yeah.
what I'm really hearing is a desire to disrupt in a loving way, because
Oh, definitely.
yeah, I mean that's what I'm hearing. That you're right. There are a lot of rom-coms and stories set around Christmas and such, and it's
Hmm.
lovely, it's perfect, and in that way. But I like that you chose a whole different season with a whole different
Yeah.
idea, but yet there's some elements of what you liked about that were brought
Yeah.
in.
And I think the fall setting too, something I was able to do that I don't think you can well, I guess you could do it with Christmas stories, but like because of it being set in fall around Halloween, there is a major part of my story is there's a mystery element to it. And that's not something I necessarily even intended when I started to write this story, but it just naturally emerged. And it is like I've been very lucky to get a lot of reader feedback and great reviews, and that is the number one thing that people say they love about the book. And it was not even initially part of the original plan of the book, which is interesting.
That is. So would you talk a little bit more about how this theme did show up for you? Like, how did you recognize that this was
Sure.
happening and then find a way to weave it in appropriately to the genre, but yet making it feel real? I mean, I would love for you to talk more about that.
Sure. So I knew that my two main characters in the romance they haven't talked in 10 years. They had an embarrassing incident happen in high school. I knew they had to have a reason to have to work together. And that forced proximity, part that often makes a romance so good. And so, because my main male character is actually a newspaper reporter, I had to figure out a reason for him to be out at this fall festival site that wasn't necessarily just covering the story of the site because, that with I work in journalism and oftentimes you'll get, like a prep piece and then maybe something doesn't happen. So he had to have a reason to stay there. And so like as I dug into like what this reason could be, I got this idea of like, well, he needs to reinvigorate his journalism. And he goes into the archive room and finds this old cold case, and it's connected to the festival site. And so once I started kind of following down that path, I realized that the case itself actually needed to be like an ongoing and sustaining part of this story that made it all work and help bring them together.
Oh, I love that. So, okay. So you've mentioned your background with
Hmm.
journalism and how
Yes,
that probably helped develop this character some because
very much so.
yeah, the nuances that help to make this character feel real, but yet you're also applying skill sets that are taught in journalism to
Yes.
create the cold case, to create that investigative skill, but to also just lay down a realistic story. But would you highlight some of the skills that you put in place? So perhaps a
Oh,
reader
sure.
is, or a writer rather, is trying to, you know, maybe they know they need to do a bit more research, but they might not be sure how they should get started or
Hmm.
how to kind of leverage some of that. Would you share some insights?
Sure. So I am, like you said, my background is in journalism, and it's something that, of course, that I enjoy and I love, and I really love the idea of investigative journalism. Now, I'm not an investigative journalist, so there was some research that had to go into that. However, I do know investigative journalists who have talked to. But in my time as a journalist, I've had to do a lot of research when you work on stories, and I knew going in that I would have to showcase that in order for him to be an authentic reporter, I had to showcase that side of it. So, I would just say if you are it's helpful if you know your character and what they do going into it, but even if you don't, I think that there's a lot of opportunities to research that and make that character more authentic. For instance, my female lead character works for a chamber of commerce, and she kind of gets put in this role of doing publicity, which is not what I do. However, I have a very dear friend who works in PR, and I'm with her a lot. I listen a lot. I'm able to ask her questions, and just being able to do those things lent such a sense of authenticity, I think, to the character. I even, for people who know me and know what I do and work in journalism, there's even some, say, I don't know, so Easter eggs, but like parts of my own life that get interjected into these characters. There's a scene, for instance, anybody who works in a public field will get public feedback, whether they want it or not, right? A lot of times it's good, a lot of times it's not so good. And there's a scene in the book where they're getting letters about a story that's written in the paper. And one thing that I actually do in real life when we get letters is we hold them up and look at handwriting, and we try to guess if it's going to be a mean or a nice letter based on the handwriting of the letter before we open it. And so I love, it's just something fun that I do in my everyday life, and so I love that I was able to incorporate that into the story because I don't, it just felt so real and like such a fun detail that people who don't work in journalism would probably never even think of.
But I love that you've incorporated something like that. There's sometimes a writer needs to realize that there's things in their own world that they do that might seem, you know, that you just realize you can incorporate into your story, or by
Hmm.
watching others, like you're saying, asking those right questions. That might just be the information that you need to say, well, let me take my curiosity at this point and see where it takes me too. So you're
Hmm.
getting the inspiration all around you. I love that.
Yeah, and I would say even like my own kids, my main character in my book loves animals and getting out in the fields. And as a kid, she had a knack for like rescuing animals that didn't necessarily even want to be rescued. And I have kids who are very curious like that. And I feel like so we had an incident with my own children where I didn't know that they had discovered a burrow of baby bunnies and hidden them in their room and were feeding them, and it was a whole ordeal. And but I feel like I actually incorporated that into my book. And I feel like that those are the kinds of details when people read that it makes it feel like more than just any other story out there. It's like these concrete details that connect you with this particular character in this particular story because it's a little off the wall, but it's memorable and it's fun and it could really happen.
But the things you're describing really help to build the setting. It helps to build the character
Hmm.
development. It really helps also with the show and tell, because you're helping to shape, what's going on with some more dimension too. And when you get that specific on something like that, it does bring that character or that world to life a little bit more. So yeah, I love that you said that. So I'm
Yeah.
curious. You've taken this book, you've got this concept where we're trucking down 2022. We've got this first pass down. You've got the outline,
Yes.
you've written the first draft. So we got to go back through at some point and start editing.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
Would you talk about like what what tips do you have for someone who might feel like editing, especially self-editing, is daunting?
Hmm.
They know they
Hmm.
need to hire an editor, but they also know that they
Hmm.
need to do the best they can with it before they turn it over, because that,
Definitely.
that helps
Uh-huh.
them. So do you have some self-editing tips that might help that writer when they're
Oh,
working through their
sure.
passes?
So I work in my day job, as I mentioned, as an editor. So I really feel like that kind of gave me an edge. Now, I want to clarify, I did still hire a professional editor after I
Yeah.
was done self-editing. But there is a very famous Stephen King saying that says, kill your darlings. And sometimes you have to kill your darlings. And so I think that both as like a self-editing and when I edit others, because I do edit others every day, I go into it and when I talk to other people, and again, I take this advice on myself too. you have to realize that I'm not telling you these things to hurt your feelings or because I don't like what you're doing, but because I want to make your story be the best that it can possibly be. And so even with self-editing, I think you have to give yourself a lot of grace. I mean, that first draft is getting it all out, right? It's when you go back through it. I don't know, going back through my first draft of my first book, I cringed. I was like, I can't believe I wrote this. What is this trash? Like, I was so hard on myself, but like I kind of had to step back and like put on my editor, like, day job editor hat and be like, okay, what would I say to a person who wrote this? I would say, this is good. This is but here's what you need to focus on to make it better. And so I have, in editing itself, I could easily get into the specifics of that. But when I was going through my own, I was saying, okay, mine is a dual point of view story, so written from two different characters. And I started to find that some of the chapters were like just repeats in a different character's point of view. And that actually wasn't helpful to the story. It was just repeating the same information. And so, like, I had to just, like I said, give myself some grace and try to do what was best to serve my story so that when I finally got it to the editor, I had already kind of prepped myself and prepped my document and prepped my mind for the feedback and the helpful criticism that I would then receive. So I would say if you're editing the first time, just to give yourself some grace and try to take a step back from your own work and do what you can to best serve your own story.
I love that. I think that that's so powerful to your point about giving yourself grace because, I mean, the sheer fact that you started this project and completed it all the way through, that you have a full draft to work with,
Mm-hmm.
that in and of itself is something to celebrate, really.
Oh, definitely.
So,
A lot of people never make it to that point.
right. So celebrate that you
Mm-hmm.
have done that. And when you're going back through, I love what you said about how does this serve the story? How does this serve my reader? How is this,
Mm-hmm.
creating the best, experience, however it is. Even if it's nonfiction, you're still creating an experience. You're creating
Yes.
some kind of transformation for your reader when it's nonfiction, but when it's fiction, you're creating an escape, an experience like that,
Mm-hmm.
a release, So how is that serving your reader? So I love that you said that. I love that you said that. When you talked about, for instance, yes, the dueling point of view, but also recognizing when something might have been a repeat. How did you go back and rework that? Meaning, how did you discern where was the right space for that? Because at first you probably felt like you might have felt like I needed to tell that in a different way. I needed to show
Sure.
it in the same way. So how did you discern which one should stay? And then the
Oh,
one that
yeah.
needed to go, how did
Yeah.
you know how to shift from the other? So how did you work through the two,
Yeah, I
for
think
instance?
I think a lot of it, well, one, I think I had to take a little bit of time after I wrote it before I went back to read it again. And I think that that's really important because you getting distance on something, even like when I write in journalism, a lot of times I'll say, I just need to sleep on it. Because when you come back to it with a fresh perspective, all of a sudden you're like, oh, okay. So what I did is I read through, like, there was one chapter in particular where I had done this, where I'd written basically the same thing from two different characters' perspectives, or two chapters. And so what I did is I read through and I thought, okay, this one's probably the stronger one. And so I just copied that whole other chapter and pasted it into another document. I didn't get rid of it. I just put it aside and I was like, okay, now I'm going to go back and read this without it and see how it looks. And I found that when I did that, it was stronger, it was more direct. And I did have to go back and add a few details kind of in that one character's perspective that stayed. But I think the big thing was one, it's not deleted, it's not gone forever. If I need it, I can pull it back. But what does it look like without it? Um, and then even then I won't ever forget texting my best friends like, I just deleted 2,000 words and I think I'm going to be sick. Like even then it's still hard, but in the end it was a better piece for it. So,
I love that. And I love that you like, in a sense, there was a bit of a mourning of I just killed some
oh,
darlings,
there is
all
mourning.
2,000
Yeah.
of them. And, but but I commend you for doing that and for recognizing that space. And to your point, putting them aside because it also might be that information might come back through in another way, even if they've
Yes. Oh yeah,
rewritten.
that's
So
so
yeah,
key.
yeah.
You
So,
know, something really interesting, and sorry if we're jumping ahead a little bit here, but when I contracted a professional editor who I just love her, she's worked in indie publishing and traditional publishing. She's awesome. One of the first things she said to me that nearly broke my heart was, I had written this great prologue. She said, I don't think your book needs a prologue. And I was like, I was like, no. But she said, save it because you're going to need those details for later in your book. And she was 100% right. And I'm so glad I took that advice and saved it and listened it. And like, because she said it will create a hook for your reader. You're not dumping all that info up front. She was totally right. And I'm so glad that I listened to that advice and I saved it. I didn't get rid of it completely, but it was the right move for sure.
that is really cool. Thank you for sharing that, because
Hmm.
you
Yeah.
that was another set of darlings that just found their way.
Yes. Oh.
I do love that phrase though, from Stephen King, kill your darlings. Yep.
Yeah.
That is, a darling could be a character, it could be a scene, it could be a set of
Yeah.
a phrase. So yes, I agree.
Hmm.
But it is still difficult nonetheless. So yes.
Just so hard. Yeah.
So we've got the book, we've got, it's been edited through someone else like you were describing, and now we're getting ready to get the cover and then hit publish.
Hmm.
So talk to me
Hmm.
about that cover, because it's so sweet. I love the cover.
Oh yeah. So you can kind of see it behind me here.
Yes.
Um, so well, a couple things happened. One, I queried before I decided to self-publish. And ultimately I was ghosted a lot and I was just really struggling with like where to go next. And I went to this awesome book signing for Elena Armas, who wrote The Spanish Love Deception, and Carrie Ray. And they were talking about how they self-published before they were ever picked up by a traditional publisher. And it just really kind of like radiated within me like, okay, I think maybe this is the path that I need to go. So once I made that decision, there were still several months in there. I decided, okay, well, now I've got to figure out how to do this self-published thing. And I fortunately know a lot of authors who have self-published and was able to reach out to them. And at first, I actually reached out to a graphic designer and started to work with her on what that book cover would look like. But her time frame, she had something happen in her life, and her time frame, she just wasn't able to meet the time that I wanted. And so I'm actually a graphic designer as well. I have worked in magazines and publishing a long time. I've done graphic design, writing, editing, you name it. And so I said, I know what I want. I think I'm going to make my own cover. And so I did. I got into Adobe Illustrator. I worked on it. I bounced ideas off of my beta reading team. My husband probably had the biggest voice in like colors and what I wanted to do with it. And ultimately, I decided on the cover that I have now. And I'm very happy with it. I've gotten a lot of great compliments. People love the colors and everything on it. So I think I was very lucky that as a self-publisher, I was ended up being able to save money that route. But I'm very happy with how the cover came out. I know most people probably can't do that, but I am very grateful that I was able to produce a cover that I was very happy with.
But what I'm hearing you saying is that basically you leveraged the skill sets that you had, and where you
Yes.
felt like you needed support, whether you wanted to make sure that even with the skill sets of having the editing background, there's still something about asking somebody else to do that for you,
Oh
because
yeah,
because
yeah.
you still can have a blind spot. I mean, I've published books myself, and even though I'm an editor, I still have other editors look at my work, because
Oh,
you're
definitely.
human.
Oh yeah. And I mean, even in my job as a journalist, I have to have somebody else edit my work. There's so many things like when you read your own stuff, you just naturally skip over stuff because your brain says, "Oh, I already know what that says." Because I hired somebody, and this was my first book, so I had never written a book before, and I hired somebody who knows book publishing, who knows romance. I mean, even that advice on the prologue, she was just invaluable. And she's for my second book, she's definitely my editor again. I love her so much. I highly recommend. I mean, that's your story is ultimately what's going to sell your book. And so I highly recommend finding an editor that you get along with, who knows the industry, who knows writing, and who can help shape your story into the best that it can be.
Speaking of, you said there's another book coming.
There is.
Would you like to tell me
So my
something?
second, yeah, definitely. So my second book is set in the same world as the first book, different characters. They were in the first book, but this is their story. And kind of like the first book is all set in autumn. This one's a summer book. And my plan is for it to publish in June. So I'm almost done drafting. It's headed to beta readers. It's on the editor's calendar. So we are full steam ahead right now. It's very exciting.
That is very exciting. So,
Yeah.
so this has been a fabulous conversation. Where can people connect with you, Jessica? Where can they get your current book? Where can they get on the list to be a part of and be aware of book 2 dropping? Connect with
Sure.
you.
So my website is jessicaboothauthor.com, and that's where all the information will land about the next book. But I am most active on Bookstagram. My handle is at all one word, read, believe, love. And that's kind of where I started. And I haven't changed to an author specific account yet, but I do a lot of book stuff on there. Those are probably the two places. I also have a Facebook group with like my reading team and all of that's in there, and that can be signed up through my link tree on my Instagram account. So I would say those are probably the three main places that you can connect with me. Oh, and to buy it. I got to mention that it's available on Amazon if you want to do that. But I always push, there's a local bookstore in Cincinnati called the Bookery. All my signed copies go through them, and it supports a local bookstore. It supports indie, and they're a new indie bookstore, and they're wonderful, wonderful people. And I fully endorse buying from the Bookery, bookerycincy.com.
Oh, very cool. Thank you so very much for this. This has been such a fun and fabulous conversation. Thank you for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.